This is just the beginning.
Welcome to our Innovative Investments in Climate Tech virtual event. I'm Niala Boodhoo, host of Axios Today, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. Thanks to HSBC for making this conversation possible during Axios' Climate Week programming, and welcome to all of our audiences on social media on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. You can join our conversation today on Twitter at Axios and using the hashtag AxiosEvents. And over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleagues, Jim Vandehei and Dan Primack. We'll be exploring alternate energy investments toward climate solutions in both the private and public sectors, and how regulatory advancements in technology are helping to mitigate the effects of climate change. Our first guest is a senator from Oregon and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hello, Senator Wyden.
Niala, a pleasure to be on.
You know, summer's officially over this week, but what a terrible weather summer we've had when you think about wildfires or heat waves and hurricanes. I wonder what it's like for you when at least 25% of Congress and about 60% of Senate Republicans are still actively denying that climate change exists as you're trying to push through all of this overhaul of the tax code to prioritize clean energy and fight climate change.
I believe we are starting to change minds. And certainly the last few weeks where climate change has hit our country like a wrecking ball. You take the bootleg fire in rural Oregon, which was so powerful. Experts said it would change the weather. You saw what happened in the South with the brutal storms. You saw what happened when it went to the East Coast of the United States. This is an altogether different matter. This is urgent business, and I believe we've got a chance now, particularly with our Clean Energy for America bill, to take transformative steps to address and combat climate change.
So a big part of that is overhauling the tax code when it comes to clean energy. What's at the top of your list for overhauling the tax code when you're speaking to Republicans?
At the top of the list, I've said, look, the tax code with their 44 separate energy provisions is tethered to yesteryear. A lot of these breaks are decades old. And what I decided to do, and the Senate Finance Committee voted for, is to take the 44 existing tax breaks on energy and put them in the dustbin of history. And then instead of the 44, we would have one for clean energy, one for clean transportation fuel, and one for energy efficiency. And then we would establish a tech-neutral, free market, no mandate system that would essentially say, the more that a company, for example, reduces carbon emissions, the bigger their tax savings. And in 100 years, the Finance Committee hasn't done anything close to being as transformative. What would happen is every year, maybe every 2 years, somebody would ladle out another bunch of tax breaks. Sometimes the tax breaks had a shelf life that wasn't much longer than a carton of eggs, and it didn't provide the predictability and the certainty that America needs to really make a cleaner, greener transformation in terms of combating climate change. My wife and I are older parents. We have a little one who's 8, twins that are 13. And when we took this action in the Senate Finance Committee, and nobody thought it would be possible, because the Senate Finance Committee is one that has a lot of influence on major issues, a lot of skepticism about whether we could get it done. I walked out, I called my children, and I said, this one's for you guys.
Another thing that you've talked about is a new levy for exchange-traded funds, ETFs, to help pay for all of this. Now, the industry is saying this will hurt smaller investors. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, my colleagues have had plenty of ideas with respect to pay-fors, and since you're asking, let me tell you about one that's at the top of my list. One of the little secrets about the tax code is that many billionaires pay little or no income taxes. The way they do that is they don't take a wage. And so Americans have read all these stories about prominent billionaires paying virtually nothing in the way of income taxes for years and years on end. I don't think that's right, because nurses and firefighters pay taxes every year on their wages. And I have proposed a billionaire's tax so that we recognize that billionaires ought to pay taxes every year, just the way firefighters and nurses are.
So, but exchange traded funds are not necessarily all, billionaires aren't the only ones doing, for example, exchange traded funds. This does involve smaller investors as well. What's your response to the financial industry who says that you'll hurt them if they have another levy against them?
Again, I haven't endorsed a particular proposal. And apropos of that area, two matters come to mind. The president has said that he's not going to have taxes on anybody with an income under $400,000. I feel very strongly about that, and I certainly wouldn't go after people's retirement accounts. So I've seen a lot of speculation about various ideas. That particular issue got on the menu of options, for example, because there were people concerned about issues relating to partnerships. But I want people who are following this program to know at the top of my list in terms of making sure all Americans pay their fair share. It is ending this, I call it loophole, where billionaires, the most successful, most affluent people in the country, can escape paying income taxes for years on end by not taking a wage. They ought to pay taxes every year like nurses and firefighters. That is at the top of my priority list.
Your House counterparts crafted a plan that provides much larger electric vehicle purchase incentives for vehicles that are union made. Are you considering including that in the Senate Finance Committee package as well?
The Clean Energy for America bill that I mentioned has a very strong electric vehicle provision. It was really crafted by Senator Stabenow and Senator Brown from Michigan and Ohio, respectively. I think it is one where we can work with our colleagues in the House of Representatives on. What this is really all about, again, is a marketplace kind of orientation. Getting a critical mass of these electric vehicles on the road is going to bring down costs. It's going to be good for the environment, good for marketplace forces in the American economy.
Senator, all of this is pretty complicated, and we at Axios love smart brevity. So can I ask, what do you want American taxpayers to remember from all of this as they're thinking about, as you're listing out your priorities and what you'd like to accomplish?
What I want them to know as they follow this discussion is that I think moderates have a very valid point with respect to how government does its business. It ought to pay for things that we really care about. I also think when we talk about paying for these investments, whether it's paid leave or childcare or home and community-based services, we ought to say everybody should pay their fair share. And that's why I hope that they'll take away from this discussion that I said, look, I'm on to how billionaires are getting out of paying any income taxes, or not much. They're not taking a wage. But on my watch as chairman of the Finance Committee, everybody is going to pay their fair share, and that means billionaires too.
Before we go, we have been talking about the role of government in all of these climate incentives. What role do you want private industry to play here, other than their fair share, as you've said, especially when we're thinking about, for example, the venture capital community?
Well, I think in a lot of areas, what we're looking for are public-private partnerships. For example, one of the parts of the 2017 tax law, the Trump tax law, that I disagreed with so strongly is it cut back on research and development tax incentives. That is absolutely necessary for the private sector to be able to compete in tough global markets. I'm going to restore that. That's something that I hear about constantly from private sector firms. Is the last thing we should be doing is what was done in the 2017 Trump tax bill, which is cutting research and development. We're going to make sure there are those incentives for those private sector risk takers you're talking about.
Thank you, Senator Wyden.
Thanks for having me.
And next we have a View from the Top segment with my colleague, Axios' co-founder and CEO, Jim Vandehei.
Thank you very much, Niala. I'm Jim Vandehei, the CEO at Axios. It's my pleasure to bring you a conversation with Dr. Celine Hawaya, who is the Group Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC. Doctor, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jim. Lovely to meet.
You're coming to us from London. You have the cool title of Group Chief Sustainability Officer. What does a Chief Sustainability Officer do?
Yeah, well, actually, for HSBC, it's a newly created role, and it's been created to kind of join the Group Executive Committee, which is essentially the top table at the bank. And it's the first time we've had that. And it's actually reflective of the movement more broadly in the corporate world to have the sustainability position at that top table. Given really these days, it's such a transformation issue. It cuts across every single part of the business. HSBC, it's one of our 4 pillars of our strategic growth strategy. We've committed to essentially have a net zero target across all of our financed emissions portfolio, right? So to be able to do that, that means fundamentally changing like how we finance, fundamentally changing our risk appetite, changing our culture, our policies, our processes, our capability. So it's going to be a massive change effort for us. And we've also committed to mobilize 1 trillion of finance for new climate solutions as well. So it definitely is something that, you know, cuts across everything we do and is at the heart of our strategy.
And what's the time frame for that? How long does it actually take to get to what are pretty, I assume, aspirational goals at this point, but you also, I assume, are tethered to specific metrics. When can you get there?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of the net zero targets these days are framed up before 2050 because that's the time frame aligned with avoiding more than 1.5 degrees of global mean warming, right? The threshold of dangerous climate change. But of course, the transformation begins now. You know, we made the commitment last year, but the effort begins now. We'll be releasing targets for what that means in terms of different sectors in our portfolio, oil and gas, power and utilities targets by the end of this year. We'll follow that with short and medium term targets across all of our sectors. But it's a huge effort that starts every day and includes, you know, how do we ramp up our sustainable infrastructure portfolio, our investment in deep decarbonization technologies. But front and center, it's really about working with every client across every single sector and partnering with them on their transition.
Climate tech sits at the center of all of this. When you look at the landscape, like, why does climate tech matter so much? And what are the areas that you find most fascinating and most promising?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, big picture, when we look at what we need to decarbonize by 2030, we pretty much have those technologies now. It's about just kind of scaling those technologies. But if we look at what we need to decarbonize from 2040 through to 2050, those technologies, you know, half of them are at prototype or development stage. So that really brings in the need to innovate, brings in the importance, especially of the kind of venture capital community, the founders of startups that are so critical in that space. And so climate tech, as you know, is kind of this new, almost, you know, in the 2000s, we had the clean tech kind of boom. We now are, you know, at the beginning stages of the climate tech boom, which is a much less monolithic area of investments, because as I mentioned, it's about transforming every sector of the economy, right? So it's about the climate tech space is about, you know, agriculture and transforming buildings, transforming manufacturing, transforming the energy grid and mobility. And it's also around a cluster of carbon removal technologies and of kind of solutions that we need to kind of look at sustainable supply chains. Interestingly, in the first half of this year, we've had in the venture space alone, we've had 16 billion of funding in the climate tech space. It's been the fastest kind of growing thematic space. So it's a very hot time if you're a founder and you're an investor in this space. We're seeing a lot of activity, a lot of deals, also at the kind of growth kind of not just the very early stage seed aid, but also big growth in the kind of larger deals as well. So this really is something that we're looking to kind of help accelerate. These are such fundamental solutions in terms of tackling climate change.
You're a global company. Obviously, climate is a global pursuit, sort of a global challenge. A lot of our audience might be in America watching this today. How much of that activity, how much of the startup activity is coming from the US versus being spread around the globe?
It's very spread around. So I did a piece of work, actually. We did the first ever review of the state of climate tech a year and a half ago, actually, when I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that work's been built on since. But we looked at a kind of 10-year time frame there and looked at the geographies. And you're right, it was heavily at that time, in that kind of decade, concentrated around the US, around Europe, as two kind of key epicenters. And that partly was to do with the maturity of regulation in that space. Now we're really seeing this is much more global in terms of hubs. That's really important. It's not just about regulation now. The key thing around climate tech now is we have a very, very robust demand signal. If you think about it, we've now got hundreds, close to thousands of companies, large, massive global companies who've committed to the net zero transition. And that commits then down the supply chain, their value chain, to being able to achieve that as well. And in many cases, the technologies that they need aren't yet, as I mentioned before, kind of commercially scalable and deployable yet. So there's this big demand push to try and get these technologies up to commercial viability right now. And it's happening across different pockets. And at HSBC, we're across 60 different companies. 60 different countries in terms of, or plus 64 or so in terms of our coverage. So we're really looking at this from a global perspective. We really need kind of solutions coming country up in these areas.
And Doctor, what is HSBC doing specifically to help these companies in this space? And are there specific areas where your investment emphasis is focused on?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Climate tech is a really big space for us. It's very interesting to a lot of our institutional, but also our private wealth clients. This week, actually, we're launching our new venture growth strategy. So within that, we have a new $100 million venture debt capital fund focused on climate tech. And specifically, the role of venture debt is we're targeting kind of early stage but high growth startups in the climate tech space. And the idea with providing debt is it doesn't really dilute the kind of founder's interest in a way. And so they can grow, but also not have to rush to go public in that sense. So they can kind of grow at their own speed, but it's backing that particular class. We're also, about to be launching a more traditional kind of climate tech venture capital fund. And in that space, we're going to be looking at the sweet spot between kind of climate tech companies across the areas of decarbonization that I mentioned before, so energy, mobility, supply chains, etc., but looking specifically at kind of software-based solutions for those. So those are kind of two of the examples right now, but we're really seeing an increased appetite from our clients. Because we're global, we know the hotspots for climate tech at the moment are in North America and China and Europe, where we've kind of had a lot of regulatory movement. But because we're global, we can operate across a much wider set. We're around in 64 plus different countries, and we really want to make sure we can help commercialize climate tech innovations across the globe.
What a fascinating investment space. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Dr. Hawiah, for this conversation. And thank you to HSBC for making this broader conversation possible.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's been great to join you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now over to Dan Primack, our business editor at Axios.
Thank you, Jim. My name is Dan Primack, business editor for Axios, and our final guest today is Tom Steyer, co-founder of Galvanize Climate Solutions, joining us from San Francisco, California. Hi, Tom.
Dan, how are you doing?
Doing well. Tom, most Americans, I think, know you, despite your business background, as a former presidential candidate. So let me start here by asking you a politics question. There are a lot of climate initiatives in President Biden's infrastructure bill and in the reconciliation bill. Do you think any of that becomes law this year?
Well, Dan, no one knows for sure, but I believe that they will become law. I believe that the Democratic Party will come to a negotiated place, which will include very important climate regulations, climate initiatives, and that specifically they will be encouraging the move to clean electricity generation across the United States during this decade. So I think it will happen. It will be significant. It will be important, and it will be very positive.
From a private investment standpoint, as somebody who's investing in climate technologies, of the things that have been proposed, what is most important in order to get the things you're trying to invest in to succeed?
Well,
within those bills.
Right. The most important thing in those bills is what I said in the last question, which is this, that we clean up our electricity generation across the country, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions related to electricity by 80%. If we're going to succeed as a country in meeting our pledge to reduce our carbon emissions, we have to start with electricity generation and understand that that's going to feed into all of the other incredible technological and innovative changes that American industry is coming up with in manufacturing, in heating and air conditioning, in terms of transportation, and in food and ag. So it really starts with cleaning up our electricity generation, but the American private sector, investors, companies are coming up with some amazing new strategies and technologies that are going to enable this country to move forward very successfully in terms of climate, but also very successfully in terms of business and job creation.
On the things that private investment is doing, you talk about reducing, fossil fuel for electricity generation, but we hear a lot about decarbonization, right? Which isn't just reducing future use; it's actually pulling out carbon that has already been put into the atmosphere. As a private investor, how realistic do you believe it is that those sorts of decarbonization technologies or carbon capture technologies can scale?
I think they're absolutely going to work. I think the question here is going to be cost and scaling. We have a massive issue in the world where we need to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And to the extent we can't get rid of them, we need to suck an equivalent amount of carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. So how is that going to work? There are two big breakdowns. You referred specifically to direct carbon capture, where you go into the air, take carbon, sequester it, and stick it in the earth. But the other thing that's going to happen, I believe, on massive scale is going to be in the natural world, where in effect, the way that we raise crops, the way that we raise animals is going to be done dramatically different, and in a way that, in effect, takes carbon out of the atmosphere and sticks it into the ground. So I think we're going to be coming at this, Dan, from a variety of ways. They're going to involve a lot of technology, believe it or not, that is very exciting, particularly in terms of measurement. But they're going to do it in massive scale around the world. I think that's going to be a critical element to us getting to net zero by 2050.
When you talk about technology being a piece of that, are there, from your perspective, enough private investors currently active in the U.S. who have these sorts of capabilities or this sort of competency? We think about venture capitalists, for example, being very, very focused on kind of traditional either enterprise software, consumer software, not so much on agri-tech, for example, like you were just talking about.
Well, it's estimated that in order to solve this climate crisis, that the world is going to have to spend $4 trillion a year, and it's spending less than $1 trillion a year. So there's a huge need for capital here. We are seeing a lot more investors, a lot more companies starting to focus on specific climate solutions, like Galvanize Climate Solutions, the company that I co-founded. But there's a need for much more. But as money comes in here, we're also going to see an explosion of entrepreneurial talent, of innovation, and of focus. And I think that combination is going to get great momentum. It's going to come up with some ideas and some technologies that are going to be very surprising and wonderful. And that's going to enable us really to get this job done, to execute in the world to solve a crisis that is here and that is urgent.
Tom, there was a huge kind of venture capital, private equity push into climate tech, about a decade ago, kind of early in Obama's term. And a lot of the investors who got into that got burned very, very badly, financially, got burned very badly. A lot of those companies either didn't succeed or went away entirely. What's the biggest difference between this generation of climate tech investing and that last one that's convincing people to get back into it?
Well, I think the first point, Dan, that has to be recognized is the urgency of the problem. 10 years ago, we were in a completely different political and societal attitude towards our climate crisis. We've had a decade of proof that what people were talking about 10 years ago as a crisis is here, and we're seeing it in the United States dramatically every year, but we're seeing it around the world. So first of all, there's a different attitude. Second of all, there has been 10 years of technological progress where clean electricity generation is now cheaper than electricity coming from fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, period, the end. 10 years ago, that wasn't true. There was a need to subsidize clean electricity. That's not true anymore. And so, in fact, we've seen dramatic changes in the ability in electric vehicles. Absolutely true. You know, what we're seeing in terms of the cost and the capabilities of electric vehicles compared to internal combustion engines is dramatically different. And what we're seeing is that technology, that basically entrepreneurial spirit, brains, drive of the American people and the American business sector are going to beat burning rocks every time.
You mentioned the American business sector within climate tech, which is a large category. But when you think about this and look at different investment opportunities, is there a segment of climate tech that you think American kind of entrepreneurship is really leading in? And conversely, is there an area where you think we are lagging behind and need to really pick it up compared to the rest of the world?
Well, look, this is a global problem, and there are people attacking this problem all over the world. But if you break it down, Dan, the normal way to divide up the places where there are big emissions are electricity generation, manufacturing, the built environment, which is basically heating and air conditioning, manufacturing, and agriculture. There's going to be massive technological change in every one of those, including agriculture. I think the United States is going to do incredibly well in terms of information, in terms of data, in terms of measurement, all of those. But it's going to be incredibly important for us too, to do well in the businesses like manufacturing, where you can touch the product. We have dominated the kinds of businesses like software that you can't touch. It's going to be really important for us as a country to do really well in the businesses of having EVs that are competitive around the world, of having systems of manufacturing where there's going to be dramatic changes that, in fact, we lead with innovation, we bring that out, and we do it here. That's going to be something that's going to be very important for our country. I am seeing incredibly exciting things in all of those places, and I believe that we're going to attack this systematically and do very well across the board.
Tom, some of the more active investors in climate tech venture capital happen to be some of the big oil companies in the US. So I'm curious, do you welcome their participation in investing in climate tech companies, or are you worried that you are letting the fox into the henhouse by inviting them into these investments?
Look, I think that there has been an increasing acceptance across the board that we need to deal with our climate crisis. And anybody who's willing to deal with that honestly and openly and straightforwardly, I welcome and I accept. What I don't like, and which I think we all need to be aware of, is greenwashing, pretending to do it, acting as if you were doing it with a very small part of your portfolio, where someplace else you're doing 50 times more to continue a fossil fuel economy. That to me is the big question. Not do we welcome anybody's attempt to come up with new technologies and move us to a cleaner economy and basically to avoid massive human suffering. Of course we welcome that. The question is it a cover to let something else happen behind the scenes that you never talk about, which is actually an attempt to continue doing the exact same thing, which is burning fossil fuels, emitting CO2, and putting the lives of everybody on the planet at risk?
Tom Steyer, whose Galvanize Climate Solutions was announced earlier this month and plans to invest billions of dollars throughout the life cycle of climate tech companies, from seed stage companies all the way up through project finance. Tom, thank you very much for joining us.
Dan, thank you so much for having me.
And thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that made us all smarter, faster. And a huge thanks to our sponsor, HSBC, for making the entire event possible. For more information or to sign up for my newsletter, Axios Pro Rata, or for Niala's podcast, Axios Today, please visit Axios.com or the Axios app. Again, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you at Axios.com.